Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 67. When you think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what comes to mind? Outrage? Fear? Hopelessness? Today's guest, Boaz Becker, has spent over a decade trying to do something that many people thought was impossible: create space for real conversations across one of the most deeply entrenched divides in modern history.
When I first started thinking about creating spaces for conversation, it was 2012, 2013, even about Israel-Palestine. But at that point, I thought Israelis and Palestinians, they don't want to have a conversation with one another. I shouldn't spend time doing that. Since then, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has globalized. Now everybody has an opinion. And I feel like we could even probably just reach 1 billion people just on top of that conflict alone. So we have a fairly strong presence on YouTube with respect to this conflict. We started many years ago, just my partners and I. One of our projects is we go around Israel and the West Bank and just videotape people. We just ask questions of people in the street and we videotape their response. That's been going on now strong for many years. So we have like hundreds of thousands of views on a monthly basis. Right now, all these questions, everything is going into the app and also helping to kind of like guide the AI in certain ways.
I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and in today's episode of the Outrage Overload podcast, we're taking a look at what it means to have meaningful dialogue when the world around you is polarized and traumatized, and when even the idea of empathy feels dangerous. From his grassroots street interviews to building AI that supports dialogue, Adam is helping shift the way people see each other, not just in Israel and Palestine, but around the world. This is not a conversation about choosing sides. It's about what it takes to keep showing up for dialogue, even in a minefield. Let's get to it. Boaz Becker, thank you so much for making time for our little show.
Thank you for having me.
So you talk about, how outrage and division are kind of a default responses to crises, and I really get that because that's something we talk about on this show a lot. But you've jumped right into a pretty intense conflict talking about Israel and Palestine. So, how do you think media has sort of driven this amplified or amplified that reflexive tribalism aspect of our nature and that specific to that conflict?
Probably differently depending on which society you're in. I think Israelis have been consuming a very different type of like media landscape for a very long time. As have the Palestinians and Americans too, right? And I feel like the way the media works is by interfacing with like their own psyche and with their own kind of like every society's narratives very differently, right? So for Jews in Israel, for example, you could just see this in the reaction to October 7th, right? Like on the day of October 7th, everyone began to say, oh, this is exactly like the Yom Kippur War. This is 1973 all over again. It's exactly 50 years after. This is what it feels like. And within about 24 hours, the analogies began to shift and everybody just spoke about pogroms and the Holocaust. And that imagery hadn't stopped, right? So it's almost like in unison, either the media or Twitter or just the entire kind of like reflexive social mechanism ended up converging on a type of analogy that made sense for everybody. I imagine that something very similar is happening on the Palestinian side too. They had in their mind faced centuries of oppression by foreign conquerors, right? By crusaders, by the British colonialists, by European interventionists. And then they see the Jews immigrating to Palestine. And within a few years, it's clear that these are just the latest manifestation of the crusaders yet again, right? And so at some point, I feel like each society ends up locking onto some set of analogies. And the rest of the media ecosystem, either deliberately or through some type of trial and error and some random walk, is detecting those memes that are very likely to simply lock into place. And I think you have different products and different technologies that can help to like accelerate that type of identification of which meme is going to be the one that sort of like that conquers the minds of these listeners. And different products and different technologies do this differently. But I think this has been a process that's been going on, in the case of Israel-Palestine, probably since the 20s, of just like a cycle of fear followed by propaganda that leads to more fear and propaganda and fear and propaganda.
So this is one of those conversations that feels like this could be the direction we go in for the next X amount of time here, because that is super interesting, and I totally relate to that. This idea that and I see a push pull in this idea of capturing these memes or riding the wave of these memes as well, right? Because the media sometimes thinks they create these things, but sometimes they're just riding a wave of a meme that's out there. But then they are amplifying it typically because they've sort of picked a side in some sense and think that's the one that's going to work, and that can cause that to drive. And I think that's a very complicated landscape for even less divisive issues. I mean, a lot of issues. But now when you say it's going to be about Gaza and Israel-Palestine, this is a whole new level. And and that's. But I think that same idea applies across a lot of topics, and it's a very interesting idea that I really like it, and it is a question like, what's your sense of that push pull? I mean, I guess it varies with each topic a little bit, but I mean, it seems like the media has influence in it, but they're also riding waves from other sources that are already occurring down, maybe boots on the ground or.
That's right, or Twitter.
Or Twitter, yeah.
Well, because like I feel like like even in the 80s or 90s, early 2000s. I think that some of the people that are getting platformed today in the news channels in Israel, and I imagine the exact same things happening in the US, would never have gotten an audience back in the day. But now it's like they can't not host these people. They can't not platform them because they already have massive following on social media. And so now it's almost like traditional media is just strong-armed into giving credible space to people who would otherwise have zero credibility. So I feel like it goes both ways. I feel like there's more and more resentment and frustration with how traditional media is done. And there's more of a subversive kind of grassroots approach to propagating these memes and these ideas. And then traditional media has to somehow bend in some bizarre shape to accommodate that. So yeah, I think there's definitely a push and pull. I think in Israel, it probably functions quite differently because the news culture there feels so pervasive. It feels like it's everywhere. Like you get in the car, it's 6:25. You say, okay, well, let's play some music for 5 more minutes because at 6:30 there's going to be the news, and at 8 there's going to be the news. At every 30 minutes there's going to be the news, and so everybody's always orbiting around that schedule. Right. And then this is what you do. The whole family gets together, 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m., whatever. You turn on the news and everybody's just glued to the TV. And it's like the news is just imbuing and installing a particular mood and a particular climate everywhere. And it's all pervasive. I don't think it's quite like that in the U.S. I think in the U.S., first of all, most people are probably not at all plugged into the news. Right. I think that probably the biggest divide is between people who care about the news and consume it and those that don't. And then within the people that care about the news, that's where you probably see a very wide ideological polarization. Is that right? Is that your intuition?
Yeah, that's what the sort of statistics on this show, that most of us that sit here and worry about news's influence and worry about misinformation stuff are just kind of forgetting that like the vast majority of people don't care about news at all. Like they aren't consuming any news. Now they kind of are because they're typically using social media, and social media is recasting oftentimes traditional media stuff, right? I mean, what did Jen Psaki say this last night or whatever, and that gets reset out through those other channels, but they don't actively participate in the news, and they think they don't care about it, even though it probably is affecting them more than they think. But yeah, it's a funny world that we live in because we're over here really concerned about journalism and all that, and then it's like no one else even cares.
Yeah, they don't care. And it's amazing to me how like when I would speak with friends who were, let's say, like very supportive of Trump, and I would tell them about some of my own kind of concerns, they had never heard these concerns in their life. They'll be like, oh, I didn't know he did. Oh, I had no clue. They lived in a completely different universe, in a completely different information bubble. And the exact same thing is happening that I detect on the Israeli-Palestinian side. It isn't necessarily the case that the Israelis don't have a narrative that is compelling. That might also be true. But that's not the reason why many people who are critical of Israel are critical of Israel. It's not because they have heard the arguments and heard the narratives and found them not to be effective. It's they've never even heard them in the first place. Or they heard a caricature of them. And the exact same thing is happening on the other side. Most Israelis had never actually confronted genuine criticism that is valid from the Palestinians' perspectives. And so it's not like their experience has been one of just constant ideological confrontation. No, it is just complete ideological homogeneity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and social media certainly makes that easier to do, and sort of if you let the algorithms pull you, that it'll draw you there more than if you were to be more of an active participant. Something I wanted to talk about with this topic as well is that with any topic, you find that we talked a little bit before we started recording that about this idea of if you have these cross-cutting ideas, you're sort of disliked by everybody, right? Everybody's after you because you don't agree quite with with your tribe about that, and you appear to be an enemy over here, and that's true of all kinds of issues. But from my perspective, what I see when people think about the Israeli-Palestinian debate is it's like a minefield, and a lot of people that may think they want to express like a cross-cutting idea, maybe they're just absolutely terrified to do it, right? And you talk about that idea that's a blocker, right? We're so agitated or traumatized. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit, because with this conflict, I see that, I feel it. Like it's a minefield that I'm leery of walking in, right?
I feel it every day. Honestly, every day I speak to my mom, it's like this. I think I grew up with my mom being on the left, very pro-peace, very pro-dialogue. That had always been her disposition. After October 7th, if there's anything that Hamas does or that the Palestinians do, it's almost like inevitably it's going to be parsed in the most cynical light. She's like, I spoke to her last night. She goes like, did you see what they did with that thing? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, and what do you think about it? And I was like, well, wait. Do you mean that you think that they did this, they did X because of Y? And she's like, why else would they do it? And it's almost like trust had eroded to such an extent that she wouldn't feel comfortable with herself if she gave a less than cynical interpretation for the other side. And I don't know what to make of it. I don't know how to explain this, but it might just be like, folks who study psychology, maybe that is just a reflection of trauma, but it's almost like in her mind, and she confessed to it because I asked her, I was like, maybe she feels there's so much pain right now that it's expensive mentally to have a picture in her mind that the other side isn't pure evil. It's like the picture of the other side that is not just monstrosity is too expensive, like mentally, to maintain. And so it's just easier to either deny or reject or just be deluded, right, by the actual reality. It could be that the reality is that the other side is always monsters. Maybe that's, give it some probability. But chances are they're less bad than you imagine, right? Maybe they're more bad than you wish, but they're less bad than you imagine. And that's probably true across conflicts. And it's just think about it like this. Like if you ask most Israelis today about, what are the worst things that happened on October 7th, they'll tell you a few things. We don't have to get into the details. They'll say, like 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you tell them, actually, I think number 2 didn't quite happen in that way, and here's some compelling evidence, they don't want. It's almost like they don't want number 2 not to have happened. Why? Why is that? I don't know. But I feel like it's when I engage in these conversations, I feel like they feel so attacked. and they feel like the need is to defend themselves and the tribe because everybody around them is attacking them, that they simply can't take the risk of there being anybody from within that is going to weaken them because they feel like they can't be any weaker.
Yeah, from all the experts we've had on here, that's part of it. I think the other piece that is that our brains are just you talked about this concern about it's too much for our brains to handle. It's too much to handle cognitively, and that's a big piece of it as well, right? Like we like things to be sort of nice, simple buckets that we can we don't have to think about it anymore. We've already dropped it in that bucket. Don't make me think about it again.
Yeah, the problem is that it's the argument that I'm trying to make for these people is that even to understand your enemy better is a good idea. Just right. Fine. They're your enemy. They're trying to kill. Okay, fine. But how are they trying to kill you? And why exactly? Don't you want to know? Isn't it in your interest to try to understand it? Just from your own self-preservation perspective. Shouldn't you try to do this? No. It's almost like they're okay sacrificing themselves rather than open their mind a little bit to the possibility things might be a little bit different because then it will protect them. And I feel like of all the different arguments, that is an argument that has worked decently well with people. They're like, you know what? Okay, I feel like I should understand the other side better. I need to understand my enemy because otherwise I'm asleep at the wheel. So let me do that. You know what? I'll engage in these conversations. I'll speak to the Gazans. I'll speak to the West Bank Palestinians because I need to understand exactly how they think so that I can protect myself. Even that's progress by my lights.
Right. Yeah, we experience the same thing here a lot. I was just feeling you while you were saying all that. Now, I've thought about this kind of idea with AI a lot. Like we often hear all the sort of bad, scary parts of where AI could go and how it could do all these terrible things or makes things worse and all this kind of stuff. And those are all kind of true, but we very seldom hear these stories about, well, we could apply AI for good. Like there are ways to apply AI for good. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people haven't seen as much of people proposing those kind of ideas because there's more of the fear mongering and everything else out there. And I did a few episodes in a thing I call Outrage Science Bites where I talked about some of those. But yeah, I think and it was surprising to hear people, I never heard anybody get with an idea like that. Yeah, because it's not out there in the news media. But so
and also I think for good, I mean, I do think we should be extremely vigilant because if you ask me, chances are AI is going to make things much, much worse in terms of polarization, right? And I imagine that those are the things that you had touched on. But it's like, I think I'd give that maybe 85% chance. 85% chance our echo chambers will thicken, our filter bubbles will thicken. It's going to be even more difficult and we'll feel even more self-righteous. Because if right now what happens is, I'm on Facebook or on TikTok or whatever, and I just watch videos that other people had created that the algorithm thinks I would like. Right now, we're going to move towards a situation where the feed is generated for me to make me feel good, to cater to all of my biases perfectly well. Right? This is just a recipe for getting into the matrix. If we can't speak to people right now, there's no way you'll be able to speak to people then. So I feel like it's likely to be a disaster. So I'm very worried about it. That being said, I think it's also possible that AI can make things much, much better. And if we're going to do it, now is the time to do it before things go, too far. And while AI is still ours to modify.
Yeah, I mean, somebody's got to try to use it for good, right? So I wanted to ask, how are you deciding, how do you recognize success in these conversations? Like, what are your benchmarks? What are you looking for that you'd say, it's working better or it's working worse?
So there's at the level of a conversation, and then there's more globally. So ultimately, I want to get to millions of conversations, right? So this is the goal, to have millions of people constantly having conversations and getting relationships out of those conversations. And I feel like that's much easier to track than even just, did they change their mind? Right now, I ask people, did they change their mind? The AI is asking, did you find that argument compelling? It could do things like this. So right now, we have a lot of people that they're filling in these surveys before they join these conversations and then after each one of those conversations. And you see, reliably, everybody moderates. Everybody moderates. How do I do this at scale? I don't know if I could serve surveys to millions of people at scale. But if I could track that now they're having relationships with people on the other side, and they're even having more conversation with people on the other side, I'm happy with that. right? So my goal isn't for them to find common ground necessarily. I think that will be an emergent outcome.
Right.
But what we have to solve for is just getting more time face to face with people you disagree with.
Right. Right. And just experience with it. I mean, it's almost like, we talk about a lot of these skills, whether I'm driving a race car or I'm doing a podcast. It's like seat time. We need seat time in these conversations.
That's right. We need seat time. And it's fascinating. I mean, many Israelis have never had that. Many Palestinians have never had that with the other side. We have people that have never spoken to Jews before. We had people who've never spoken to Palestinians before. It's not easy, honestly, to find Jews and Arabs and Palestinians in particular to have conversations with. How do you go about it? It's not that easy. There isn't a single place where you can actually do it reliably in a healthy manner. It's you have to work quite hard to discover that. So in those societies, I mean, even in Israel, yes, Israel has 20% of its citizens are Arabs, and many of them consider themselves to be Palestinians. But they're not integrated in the way that you would wish, right? So it's not like they're actually having those types of conversations. They don't. And so even the linguistic and cognitive muscles that you need to have to develop in order to have these conversations successfully, they don't have that. And I feel like it's very clear. You see a lot of the messaging that Israelis push out to the rest of the world. It's like, you're just tone deaf. Or you're not hearing how it sounds. They don't hear how it sounds. They've never gotten pushback in their society. In the US, it's very different. You can have Israelis, you can have Palestinians, they could be best friends. This is much more common in the US. Over there, in some of these societies, it's much more difficult. But even in the US now, like Democrats and Republicans, how often are those friends? Probably less and less, right? It's not that easy, even for me to find. I think I might have a handful of friends who are Trump supporters, probably not even a handful. I have to work pretty hard to find them. Things like Braver Angels, was useful in that.
Right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned, that common ground isn't necessarily a first order outcome you're looking for. Because, one of the things, the holy grail for a lot of people is somehow I'm going to convince all these people that my way is the right way and we're all going to and that's how we solve polarization, is we just all think the same way. Whereas, a lot of we talk about here is like, common ground's great when you can find it, but there's also peaceful coexistence, right? And learning how to coexist with folks that see the world differently, and getting used to that, like making that, like being comfortable with that, like that's a reality we're going to live in. Like we're not going to convince, neither side is going to convince everyone on the other side to think exactly like they do. We're going to live in this world where people have different perspectives, and we have to get better at like seeing that as a reality we have to live in without either hunkering down in our bubbles or just constantly at war with each other. So I think that's something that I struggle with trying to communicate to listeners here, because even people that say they're sort of fed up with the vitriol, but my answer is to convince them to think properly, and that winning an argument is the way to do that. And I don't exactly know the answer to get. I just keep preaching the same things over and over and hope it lands at some point. That and I often talk about how even when you win, you lose. If you go like a flat earther, for instance, right? So if you bring me a bunch of facts about flat Earth, and even if those facts are right, you're not going to change my worldview on that, right? You're not likely to change my worldview on that, because we don't see those facts the same way. We don't have the same motivations.
That's right.
But we can still peacefully coexist, right? You're probably not going to change my mind on it. I'm not going to change your mind on it. Maybe I will, but that's not my goal. It doesn't necessarily need to be my goal either. But this idea that I can just rattle off a bunch of facts, and as soon as you know these facts, you'll see the light.
That's right. Yeah. No, I think that's right. It's very interesting. So I have this intuition. I don't know if anybody's done research on this, but from some of the conversations we've had, I see that people that change their mind, I don't know if it's because of certain arguments, but it might have to do with the quality of the relationships that they've been building. And the quality, I think, is a function of frequency and variety. That's kind of my intuition. It's like, now it's like, this is not just a one-off. They see this person every Tuesday, they come for our 8 p.m. call. Boom. Now it's just, weekend, wake out, weekend, wake. They see the same face. And sometimes we talk about Israel-Palestine, but sometimes we drift into talking about, like Trump and the American politics and the woke left or whatever. And then we swing back to Israel-Palestine, and then it's just a side conversation about sex and relationships and what's it like to date in Gaza. You're like, geez, all right, I guess now we're walking back. Now we're talking about, dating apps, and now we're back into like 67 and 67 borders and war, right? So I feel like it's like all of a sudden within the course of a relationship, you've just covered a lot of ground. And at the end of that, I see people just changing their mind radically. In moderation. Everybody's just like, I guess, we could live with that. And I'm also not convinced, just like to the last point that you were making about the need for coexistence with these narratives, I'm not convinced that really what should happen is that the Israelis should all adopt the Palestinian narrative. Palestinians are unlikely to all become ardent Zionists. So that's not going to happen, right? They see the Zionists as colonialists. I get it. Zionists, Jews in Israel, they see Palestinians as anti-Semites. I get it, right? It's easy for each of these sides to see the other in that light. Easy, right? But it could be that the way out isn't even a shared narrative, but it is a narrative. Each society gets its own narrative, but it's a kind of narrative that can allow for coexistence with the other's narratives. And I feel like it is very difficult cognitively to go through that kind of like story iteration, but I think it'll be much easier for AI to do that. So I'm very curious. So right now, like our AI is not just trying to detect solutions and interesting stories that are novel, that can facilitate coexistence. It's slowly trying to contribute its own ideas and just throw those into the mix and have people engage with them.
I could see people getting nervous about that, seeing it as like it's manipulation and it's indoctrination of some sort.
But it's explicit, right? It's like it's on a chart. This is a list of ideas that the AI came up with. You could choose to engage with it. You could choose not to. You could choose to. What is likely to happen is maybe collectively, maybe this is how you find some common ground. Israelis and Palestinians collectively hate all of the AI's ideas.
Right. Yeah, we can bind together on that. When you were talking about that there, I thought about something else I think AI could potentially play a role, and I'm curious to hear about it. Like, we know there's lots of evidence about this. There's lots of science on this that, we've mentioned this a few times, that, storytelling is much more persuasive than, sort of rattling off facts. But, the funny thing is we keep telling people that with the fact that storytelling is more effective than, and what we find, I talked to David Helfand on the show, and, and he was talking about how basically science kind of needs a marketing team, right? I mean, they're just not very good about particularly selling ideas be outside other academics, right? I mean, with academics, the facts work. Like you give that factual story, and then it tends to be persuasive, right? But for the general population, that's not the way it works. And so that seems like a thing AI could help with. Like here's a narrative that maybe could be a compelling narrative for your same position that you're trying to sell with facts, and just teach us more about storytelling, maybe, because this is what's lacking now. I hear so many scientists talking about this, but nobody's answering the question, well, how do I do storytelling?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I thought that for many years now. I think that what is crucially missing from the Israel-Palestine discourse are like poets. Just people to give us more stories, interesting stories of how the future can unfold. Even just to give us some input so that we can build vision. We have no vision. No one has vision in this space. And it's so difficult to be imaginative in this space. So let alone how to even articulate a story. What should a story even... Give me some examples of stories. People have very bad stories here. And I think it's almost like their imagination module in their brain is just shut off because of fear and violence and the conditions of the region. But AI is somewhat detached from that. So I think it already does. Like, so I asked it a bunch of questions, like, give me some creative solutions to the conflict, right? It comes up with all sorts of interesting things. What are some like shared narratives that you think Israelis and Palestinians could get behind? It keeps, every time I ask it questions like this, it keeps orbiting around the city of Hebron and the tomb of the patriarchs and the figure of Abraham as the unifying figure. It could bring everybody together. And how can you turn Hebron into some form of example of like Hebron right now is in the West Bank and kind of like deeply sectioned off, one for the Jewish community and the other for the Arab Palestinian community, and with checkpoints within it and surveillance, and it's rough for everybody. How can you turn Hebron into something that is a bit more aspirational? The AI came up with that. I was like, that's interesting, just as a flashpoint in what could be. So anyway, more of that is what I hope for AI. There's another idea that I spoke to a Palestinian friend of mine, and he told me about a Jewish friend of his who went to Israel. And this is her first time in Israel. She's a Jewish woman from America. She went to Israel. She got in a taxi cab in Ben Gurion, and the driver was a Palestinian Arab. And she started to freak out. She doesn't, in her bubble, she can't, what is he going to do to her, And fortunately for her, she was there with another passenger in the car. And they were driving, but at some point that passenger was let off. And it was just her and the driver, and she began to have a panic attack. And at some point, the driver realized it. So he pulls over, right? And he goes to her, and he's like, look, you're going to be okay. Here's some water, I'll be your protector here, right? I'll guard you. Don't worry. There's nothing bad that can happen. And he told me that there's almost this, I don't know if it's a narrative trick or psychological trick, where the idea is, how do we begin to see the other as our savior? Not just that we're not going to be each other's murderers. How do Jews see the Palestinians as their saviors? And how do Palestinians see the Jews as their saviors, their protectors? How do we drive towards something like this? You ask most Israelis and Palestinians, they can't go and reason in that way. This is way too abstract and far-fetched. What are you talking about, right? They're blowing up our buses today, right? Like they're shooting missiles to our houses today. But the AI doesn't have that baggage. So the AI asked her those questions. It came up with all sorts of interesting imagery. It came up with it was like an IDF tank, manned by a Palestinian, killing Nazis. All sorts of crazy things like that. You know what I mean? Like protecting the Jews from the Nazis with the IDF tank. I don't know. I feel like there's just an avenue for creativity that we've tapped with Gen AI technology, and I figure we just have to, squeeze it for what it's worth.
Mm-hmm. One of the challenges that you kind of hinted at it with the idea of the summary, right? And what are people going to think about the summary, and if it, does it seem biased when they hear the summary? And you also talked about that earlier. You talked also about just how we interpret the words themselves, and that's a big problem that we have. That use the same word, but people mean very different things by it, and that can create a lot of this kind of talking around each other kind of problem. Is there an opportunity there for the AI to maybe help, maybe elaborate those definitions a little bit and see if people are on the same page or something like that?
1,000,000,000%. I get that a lot. It's very interesting because I see that less as a feature of Israelis and Palestinians and more of Americans. So where they just totally speak at it's very interesting because even when we have conversations about Israel-Palestine with Americans, oftentimes they would use words like colonialism, settler colonialism, that would be part of the lexicon. For Palestinians, they say something very specific. This checkpoint right there in Kalkilia is upsetting me. I don't like it. Take it off. Why do I need this here? It's so much more concrete. And so it doesn't bubble up into very high level conceptual frameworks that then are bundled with so much connotation and baggage. It doesn't have to be like that. You could just zoom into the details because you know the details. If you don't know the details, then it's a lazy shorthand and you just use big words like colonialism. I think the AI could just say, okay, just pause here for a minute. What exactly do you mean here? Let's just unpack it. We don't need this baggage. Just unpack it. What are you referring to? You could say that the West Bank is apartheid. You could make that case. But why, if you could just describe the West Bank in its absolute detail? Just describe the detail. What you like and what you don't like about what's happening in the West Bank without using these big words like apartheid.
Yeah, and this gets us to a fundamental challenge we have too, because often we have kind of made a decision and we aren't really too sure what facts or what is the basis for that decision, right? We just kind of live with it, we hold on to it. But if we had to explain it to ourselves, and that's a part of, people talk about how you do these dialogues by continuing to ask those questions, Yeah, I don't know if you run across street epistemology or sort of this idea of deep canvassing, that kind of thing can help bring out some of that. But most of us, when we actually have to go defend our position, we really don't have that much behind it. We just believe it, but we don't exactly know why. And so, what's the best way for people to learn more? I think it sounds like YouTube might be the place where there's the most activity that's public, right?
Yeah, you can find you can just like find our newsletter on headon.ai and our in our wait list. So get on headon.ai. Then we'll send you an email with everything you need to know. And also I'm at adam@headon.ai. If people have questions, thoughts, ideas, feedback, anything.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate that. Adam Becker, thank you so much for making time for our show again.
David, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you want to hear more from Adam Boaz Becker, you can find the full interview on our YouTube channel at Outrage Overload. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.